The wind howled through the deserted streets of New York, carrying with it a biting cold that seeped through Emily's thin clothes like icy fingers. She pulled her knees to her chest, shivering uncontrollably as she huddled in the dark corner of an old brick building. Snowflakes drifted down, settling onto her tangled brown hair and the tattered remains of what had once been a coat. Her fingers, numb and stiff, clutched at the only possession she had left. A frayed, threadbare blanket. It was barely enough to keep her warm, but it was all she had. She curled into herself, teeth chattering as waves of hunger clawed at her empty stomach. The city bustled around her, indifferent to her suffering. People passed by in thick coats and scarves, their heads bowed against the cold, too preoccupied with their own lives to notice the shivering girl in the shadows. A dull ache settled in her chest. She had lost count of how many nights she had spent like this, cold, alone, invisible. The harsh reality of survival on the streets had stripped away any remnants of childhood innocence she once had. She knew better than to expect kindness from strangers. Then through the silence she heard it, a faint, pitiful whimper. Emily lifted her head, her breath visible in the freezing air. Her gaze swept across the dimly lit sidewalk until she spotted a shape beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp. A dog, a large German shepherd. Its fur, matted with dirt and snow, was curled up beside a garbage bin. It was trembling violently, its ribs faintly visible beneath its thick coat. The animal lifted its head slightly, ears twitching as if sensing Emily's gaze. Then with a quiet whimper, it dropped its head back onto the icy pavement, too weak to move. Emily hesitated. She barely had enough to keep herself warm. She knew that, but something about the way the dog lay there, abandoned and shivering, stirred something deep within her. She knew what it felt like to be unwanted. Carefully she unwrapped the thin blanket from around her shoulders, the cold instantly biting into her skin. Her eyes and shook as she crawled toward the dog, her breath coming in soft, uneven gasps. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The dog didn't flinch, only shivered harder. Emily's heart twisted slowly. She draped the blanket over the animal's body, tucking it in as best as she could. The dog let out a soft whine, its eyes flickering open, deep brown and filled with something Emily recognized all too well. Loneliness, fear, desperation. "It's okay," she murmured, reaching out when the dog didn't pull away. She gently ran her fingers through its cold, damp fur. "You're not alone." The German shepherd exhaled a shaky breath, escaping its muzzle. Then ever so slightly it inched closer to her, pressing its body against her side. Emily sucked in a breath, the warmth of the animal surprising against the cold night. A lump formed in her throat. She had nothing left in this world, no family, no home, no future, and yet for the first time in a long time she didn't feel quite so alone. The morning light crept over the rooftops, casting a pale glow over the snow. Sea-overed streets. Emily stirred beneath the crumbling awning where she had spent the night, her body stiff from the cold. She felt a warmth beside her and turned to see the German shepherd still curled against her side. The tattered blanket wrapped around them both. A small smile tugged at her chapped lips. The dog had stayed. "Guess we're stuck with each other now, huh?" she murmured, brushing her fingers through his thick fur. His ears twitched at her voice, and he lifted his head, gazing at her with those deep, intelligent eyes. He was still thin, his ribs too, pronounced beneath his coat, but there was strength in him and something else, loyalty. Emily sat up, stretching her sore limbs. "We need to find food," she said. The dog blinked at her as if understanding. They wandered the city together, Emily keeping a watchful eye on the passers-by, looking for anything. Scraps left behind, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten on a bench, but food was always hard to come by, and people weren't quick to offer kindness to a homeless girl and a stray dog. By midday her stomach ached with hunger. She and the dog, whom she had started calling Shadow, found a spot near a subway entrance where people flowed in and out their pockets, jingling with loose change. Emily sat down on the cold pavement, pulled her knees to her chest, and took a deep breath she had always loved to sing before life had taken everything from her, before the streets had become her home. She had spent hours listening to music, dreaming of a day when she could stand on a real stage. She wasn't on a stage now, but she had nothing left to lose. Closing her eyes, she began to sing a soft, sorrowful melody that drifted through the busy street, her voice, though, raw and weary, carried with it something real, something broken, yet beautiful. People passed, most without a glance. A few turned their heads but kept walking. Then Shadow did something unexpected as Emily sang the dog, stood beside her ears, perked eyes scanning the crowd when someone walked by too closely. He wagged his tail and let out a soft bark, not threatening, just enough to make them stop, a businessman in a suit. Hesitated, looking down at the dog, then at Emily. With a small shrug, he reached into his pocket and dropped a few coins onto the pavement. Emily's breath caught another passerby, a woman in a thick winter coat, paused watching the dog before kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "What a beautiful boy," she murmured, smiling at Shadow. She glanced at Emily, then dug into her purse and handed her a $5 bill. Emily stared at the money, disbelief washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered. The woman gave a small nod and walked away. Shadow nudged Emily's hand with his nose, as if urging her to continue. She did for the first time since she had been on the streets. People were noticing her, not with pity, but with interest, and it was all because of him. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, Emily had made more money in one day than she usually did in a week, enough for a warm meal. As she and Shadow walked toward a small convenience store, she caught sight of someone watching them from across the street. An older woman in an elegant coat stood near a cafe window, her gaze fixed on Emily and Shadow. She had an air of quiet importance about her, as if she didn't belong to the rush of the city, but observed it from a distance. Her eyes held something else too. Curiosity. Then, just as suddenly as Emily noticed her, the woman turned and walked away. Emily frowned, a strange feeling curling in her stomach. She didn't know it yet, but fate had just taken its first step toward changing her life forever. The night was bitterly cold, the wind cutting through the streets like a knife. Emily pulled her coat tighter around her thin frame. Shadow trotting beside her, his ears perked for any sign of danger. The day had been good, better than most. Thanks to Shadow, she had made enough money, singing to buy food for both of them. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She glanced down at him as they walked. "You really are my lucky charm, huh?" she murmured, reaching out to ruffle his fur. Shadow gave a small huff, his warm breath visible in the icy air. But as they turned into a dimly lit shortcut to the abandoned lot where they sometimes slept, Emily's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. She barely had time to react before she heard footsteps behind her. Then a rough voice sneered, Well, what do we have here?" 3 figures stepped out from the shadow, young men no older than 20. Their clothes ragged, but their eyes filled with something Emily recognized, desperation. She had seen others like them before. People who had been beaten down by the streets, who had given up on anything but survival. Got anything for a sweetheart? One of them asked, his lips curling into a cruel grin. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She took a step back, gripping her bag tight against her chest. I don't have anything. The tallest one, his hood pulled low over his face, took another step forward. "Don't lie," he growled. "We saw you today. You made some money, didn't you?" Emily's heart sank. They had been watching. "Come on, just hand it over." Another said, "It's not like you got much use for it." Shadow let out a low, warning growl. His fur bristled, his stance rigid as he placed himself between Emily And the men, call off the mutt, the tallest thug spat. Or we'll do it for you. Emily took another step back. Please, she whispered, just let us go. But mercy was not something found in alleyways like this. The tallest one lunged. Emily gasped, stumbling backward. But before he could grab her, Shadow exploded into action. A deep, feral snarl tore through the air as the German shepherd launched himself at the attacker, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm. The thug let out a scream of agony, thrashing as Shadow held on, teeth sinking deep into fabric and flesh. The other two panicked. Get him off, one shouted, raising a boot to kick. Emily saw it happen in slow motion. The foot swinging toward Shadow's ribs. No, she screamed, but Shadow didn't let go, even as the kick connected, knocking him sideways. With a painful yelp, he scrambled back to his feet. Lips curled, teeth bared, he stood his ground, unwavering. The leader, clutching his bleeding arm, stumbled. "Pee back, screw this!" he hissed, pain and fury in his eyes. "Let's go." The three of them turned and ran. Silence fell over the alley, save for the ragged sounds of Emily's breath and the soft whimpers coming from Shadow. She dropped to her knees beside him. Shadow. She choked out, her hands shaking as she ran them over his fur. He was hurt. She could see the way he trembled, feel the tension in his body. Tears burned her eyes. She had nothing in this world, no home, no family, but she had him. "You're all I have, buddy," she whispered. Pulling him close, his body was warm against hers, his heart beat. Strong despite the pain, Shadow licked her cheek, his way of saying, "I'm still here." Emily closed her eyes, holding him tight. She didn't know how, but somehow they had to keep going. Emily sat on the cold pavement, her arms wrapped protectively around Shadow. His breathing had steadied, but she could tell he was in pain. The fight had taken its toll. Every time he shifted, he let out a faint whimper, and Emily's heart clenched. She had to do something. But what? She had no money for a vet, no place to take him. The world had always ignored her suffering. Why would it care about a dog? Snowflakes drifted down, melting as they touched her skin. The city moved around her, indifferent. And then someone stopped. A soft voice broke through the haze of her fear. "You." Emily looked up. Standing in front of her was the older woman from before, the one who had watched her sing, the one who had walked away that day. But now she wasn't walking away. She was looking down at Emily and Shadow with something unreadable in her eyes. "I've been looking for you," the woman said. Emily tensed instinctively, bracing herself. People didn't look for girls like her unless they wanted something. The woman knelt, her expensive coat brushing the filthy ground. "Your dog." She hesitated, her eyes locked on Shadow, studying him as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "What's his name?" Emily swallowed Shadow. The woman's expression softened. "Of course it is." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman exhaled, shaking her head slightly as if lost in thought. "Years ago, I was a professional dog trainer. I worked with police. Canine service dogs, and once I had a German shepherd. He was my pride and joy, a champion. But one day, he was stolen. I searched for him everywhere, but he was gone." Her gaze darkened with emotion. "Your Shadow, he looks just like him." Emily felt a pang of unease. "He mine," she said quickly, pulling Shadow closer. "I don't care who he looks like, he's mine." The woman's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles. "I can see that, and I wouldn't dream of taking him from you." Emily blinked, caught off guard. The woman looked at Shadow again, her eyes filled with something Emily recognized: pain, but also hope. "I saw you two that day," she continued. "I saw how he watches over you, how you take care of him, even when you have nothing yourself." Emily swallowed hard. "Your special child. You remind me of myself when I was young, tough, stubborn, but kind." The woman's eyes softened. "And that's why I want to help you." Emily stiffened. "I don't need help." A small chuckle. "I think you do." The woman reached into her coat and pulled out a business card. She held it out, but Emily hesitated before taking it. "My name is Margaret Caldwell." The woman said, "I have a home, a warm one, and a place where dogs are trained, cared for, loved. I'd like you and Shadow to come with me." Emily's fingers tightened around the card. Why Margaret studied her carefully, because "I see something in you, strength, loyalty, a connection with that dog that's rare. And I believe in fate." Emily looked at Shadow. His golden brown eyes met hers, trusting, waiting. She had spent years running, surviving, but for the first time in forever, someone was offering her a different path, and for the first time she wasn't sure she wanted to run anymore. The warmth was the first thing Emily noticed for so long. Cold had been her constant companion, biting at her fingers, wrapping around her bones, making every breath feel like ice. But now, as she sat curled up on a plush couch, wrapped in the softest blanket she had ever felt, the warmth seeped into her skin like a foreign but welcome presence. Shadow lay beside her, his massive head resting on her lap. His fur was clean now, his body strong and well-fed. The wound from the alley fight had healed, thanks to the vet Margaret had taken him to the moment they arrived at her home. Their home, Emily, still had trouble believing it. Margaret Caldwell's house wasn't just a house, it was a sprawling estate on the edge of the city, surrounded by rolling fields and a massive training facility where dogs of all kinds were being trained for police work, search and rescue and therapy programs. For the first few days, Emily had been cautious. Suspicious years of surviving on the streets had taught her that nothing good lasted, but Margaret hadn't asked for anything in return. Instead, she had given Emily a chance, a warm bed, food, clean clothes, and something even more important, a future. "Come with me," Margaret had said one morning, leading Emily into the training center. "You already have a gift with animals. Let me teach you how to use it." And so Emily had learned days turned into weeks, and for the first time in years, she had a routine. She attended school, something she hadn't done since she was 12. She worked with the dogs, learning their behavior, training techniques, even medical care. She thrived, and Shadow, he had become a legend, Margaret had called it. From the start, he had once been a trained dog, likely stolen and abandoned. His instincts were sharp, his intelligence undeniable. With proper care, he had flourished, proving himself to be not just a protector, but a partner. But no matter how well trained he was, Shadow never left Emily's side. Even now, as the snow fell outside, he sighed deeply, pressing closer to her warmth. Emily glanced out the large bay window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Somewhere out, there were the streets she had once called home, the cold corners, the empty nights. She reached down, running her fingers through Shadow's fur. "We made it, buddy," she whispered. Shadow let out a soft, contented huff. For the first time in her life, Emily didn't have to wonder if tomorrow would be better, because she already knew it would be. And so, against all odds, Emily and Shadow found their way home, not just to a warm place to sleep, but to a life filled with purpose, love, and hope. What started as a simple act of kindness, a homeless girl sharing her only blanket with a freezing dog, became the very thing that changed her destiny in return for her selflessness. Fate gave her something she had long forgotten, a second chance. Shadow was no longer just a stray. He was her protector, her family, her best friend, and together they proved that even in the darkest of times, kindness has the power to lead us to the light. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Amazing Paws Stories. We bring you the most heartwarming, emotional, and inspiring animal stories, because sometimes the love between a human and an animal can change lives in the most unexpected ways. Stay tuned for more incredible stories that will warm your soul.